So let me start my presentation here this morning with two remarks. One is that the question of gay marriage has of course generated enormous controversy in the countries that have recently introduced gay marriage, especially in France and to a lesser extent in the United Kingdom, but of course there are many other countries as well. And I think we've sort of seen two extreme reactions: either the idea that any critic of gay marriage is a homophobe and wants to sort of ban homosexuality and make it illegal again on the one hand, or sort of accusations of gay marriage being single-handedly responsible for the destruction of the family and the demise of the West. And as you can imagine, both of these extreme positions are a little bit over the top. My intervention, I hope, will be an attempt to bridge that kind of hysteria and to suggest that we can have a more sensible and a more reasonable discussion of gay marriage, but also while sticking to very clear principles. So I will be arguing that I think gay marriage is a problem for the institution of marriage and for the family, but I will also suggest that equality is a continuing concern, and we need to think very hard about how to treat everyone equally before the law and not engage in any form of discrimination. In fact, it goes for both majorities and minorities. And so if we're serious about equality and non-discrimination, it has to apply to both, not just a silent majority or a vocal minority. So why do I think gay marriage is a problem? Well, very briefly, because I think secular law, by instituting gay marriage, has abandoned the idea that marriage is a social institution with a biological foundation. Instead, secular law has now adopted a purely formalist and procedural conception based exclusively on individual rights. It should now be everyone's right to get married, independently of anything else. So there's no reference to any mutual obligations among equal individuals. Nor do I think that gay marriage actually provides more genuine equality and extend the virtues of marriage to same-sex couples. And the reason for saying this is that the meaning of marriage has been changed beyond recognition. By having gay marriage, we now have a purely contractual arrangement between two consenting adults who agree to engage in cohabitation. But that's simply not the same as the institution of marriage historically and socially understood across time and space in very different societies around the world. That's not to say that cohabitation should be banned, of course not, but it's just not clear we should call it marriage. So it is a question of much more than just semantics. There are different institutions, marriage is one, cohabitation is another, and there's simply no reason why we should call them the same. Now, we might well want to give a new status to the cohabitation of same-sex couples. We might want to call it union, we might want to call it partnership, but why call it marriage? There's simply no good reason to do so. Indeed, I think it's this attempt to just make everything homogeneous and uniform that is the problem here. So I think in the light of secular law now having instituted gay marriage in a number of countries, there is an unprecedented opportunity, I think, to uphold the principle of marriage between a man and a woman with view to having children, which is a millennia-old practice that precedes secular institutions of states and markets, as well as religious institutions such as the church, the synagogue, the mosque, and the temple. Marriage does not belong to any of these institutions, secular or religious. And I think it's important that different institutions now think about how they can value it. And I think that's a challenge above all for religions. In some ways, one could argue that real marriage, the idea of the union of man and woman with view to having children, is now an almost exclusively religious institution, because secular law no longer recognizes it. But that also means that religions have a perhaps even greater responsibility to uphold that institution, to explain what it's about, and to promote it. So rather than just seeing it as a kind of lost battle, I think we should see it as an opportunity to be much more creative about marriage going forward. But let me say a little bit more about the crisis of marriage and the crisis of the family. I think they're both under attack, but for very different reasons. It's essentially because we live in a culture that now promotes a period of sort of temporary contract between two adults that can be undone at any moment's notice. I don't want to caricature any country or culture, but of course the sort of Las Vegas sort of weddings, I think, might be just one indication of what's becoming more mainstream. There's lots to like about Las Vegas, but maybe not quite that aspect. On the other hand, you could also say that the family is increasingly seen as just a mere natural necessity, which sort of loses its relevance as adolescents become more autonomous. So what do we do? Well, I think the problem is that we engage too much in a sort of obsession with negative liberty. The idea that the only content we can give to liberty is the absence of constraints from others. And in the end, what that leads to is a tyranny of personal choice, which then holds supreme sway over more mutual and reciprocal arrangements. If you like, to put this briefly, we only ever concentrate on individual rights and entitlements. We don't think about mutual obligations to one another and to society. But I think there are more attacks on marriage and the family than that. Indeed, forms of libertarianism and capitalism are extremely problematic for marriage and the family. Libertarianism, broadly speaking, seeks to roll back the frontiers of the state in order to eliminate public constraints on the exercise of private desire. And capitalism, in some sense, promotes the extension of the market in all areas of society as a universal medium for contractual relations. But this is purely governed by exchange value. So what we see here is a confluence. Libertarianism rolls back the state, capitalism promotes the market, and we end up with just contract and just exchange. Now, I might be worried about the interference of the state, for instance, by legislating on an institution like marriage. But that doesn't mean that I'm in favor of the market now invading the private sphere either. So I think we have to balance our critique of excessive state interference with also a keen awareness of just how central the market now is to our understanding of family, marriage, and education. In the end, I think the problem with both libertarianism and capitalism is that they deny any transcendent shared ends. It's a form of materialism. It actually comes quite close to Marxism in that respect, because it views exchange as the only sphere invested with quasi-sacred significance. There's nothing else now that has value other than exchange. And I think that's something that should concern us all very, very much, whether we're religious or not. Indeed, this liberal thinking that underpins both libertarianism and capitalism produces a paradox. It not only privatizes the public square, but also opens up the private sphere to the forces of market commodification. But of course, in order to have the market, you need the state, because which institution can introduce the market? Which institution can uphold the rule of law that enables the market to expand? It's in fact a strong state. So actually, even those who talk about the market very often champion the state in other ways as well. Think, for instance, of all the surveillance. Surveillance comes with extending the market. So we should all be concerned that when we promote the market, we may also in fact promote the strong state behind it. Now, this is the sort of general picture. Let me move on more specifically to gay marriage, and then at the end to what we can do differently to promote the family. I think the problem with gay marriage goes way beyond just legal changes. The big problem, in fact, is that it marks a wholesale redefinition of the norms that characterize social relations. Because when we define marriage now in homosexual terms as just a temporary contract between consenting adults, what we effectively do is we bracket biology out of the picture. We now say that neither sex nor procreation are any longer fundamental to marriage. Because the problem with gay marriage is this: you cannot impose heterosexual marriage on homosexual couples because consummation and procreation don't apply. There's no way of legally codifying what consummating a homosexual relationship would be, or indeed what procreation would be by definition. So since you can't do that, but since you need legal equality, you now have to impose the norms of a homosexual relationship on heterosexual couples. So you now cut out sex and procreation, which leaves us just with this idea that it's cohabitation between consenting adults, a contract we sign and that we can cancel at any point. So why is it a problem that we're cutting out biology? You know, in some sense you could say, well, maybe biology is just holding us back. Maybe, you know, it's a constraint on us. It's, again, a constraint on our individual freedom. So maybe it's a good thing. Well, not really. Because in the end, what we do is we encourage increasingly a kind of post-humanist conception of relationships, where in fact, increasingly we open up the private sphere, not just to libertarian and capitalist ideas, but to forms of technology that change the very nature of human beings. Indeed, if you look at the French debate on gay marriage, it's very interesting. They were less concerned with the actual legislation on gay marriage as they were concerned with consequences that would be caused. And that's, for instance, to do with reproductive technologies and surrogacy. Let me quote the US commentator Christopher Caldwell, writing in the FT a few months ago. He writes this: "The French distrust surrogate motherhood, especially if money is involved. They believe it subordinates sexuality to a capitalist ethic. Non-traditional child-bearing and wearing often seem one step away from prostitution or slavery." This is quite strong language, but I think it does highlight a genuine concern. The philosopher Jean-Claude Michéa has described the surrogate mother as a mere proletarian whose labor power must be put at the disposal of those couples who have the capital necessary to rent it for temporary use. Again, this is strong language, but it does, I think, make a good point. The feminist philosopher Sylvie Agacinski, who is in fact the wife of the former socialist Prime Minister Lionel Jospin, wrote in 2009 that France's reluctance to embrace in vitro fertilization was a sign of its resistance to join the market in bodies. Because gay couples cannot produce children themselves, gay marriage will favor recourse to reproductive technologies, which France tightly regulates. So again, it highlights a side effect. And again, gay marriage isn't the only reason why we're seeing a rise in reproductive technologies and all sorts of other post-humanist tendencies. But it does provide yet another impetus to this. And that's why I think one has to be very careful when changing the legislation on marriage. In fact, because it does so, the new law on same-sex marriage ignores perennial principles and long-standing practices that transcend the specificities of different cultures. Because as the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss remarked some time ago, marriage is a social institution with a biological foundation. That is simply true over time and across space. And I think the problem with gay marriage is that it now eliminates the biological foundation altogether. In fact, this doesn't rest on any kind of narrowly religious account of the world at all. This is in fact shared by many non-religious thinkers. Take, for instance, the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell. He made the point that it is through children, and I quote, "It is through children alone that sexual relations become of importance to society and worthy to be taken cognizance of by a legal institution." In other words, the reason why we used to have laws on marriage at all is because it was a form of recognizing the benefits to society as a whole of marriage and family. It's not to say that you can't have anything else. It's just to say that there is intrinsic worth and there's also benefit to society as a whole. Right, let me move on very quickly to the final part, which is to say a little bit more why it devalues the meaning of marriage, and then just at the end, in one sentence or two, what's possible. So I've already said that there's legal problems with it about consummation and procreation. I've also made the point that it goes against anthropological conceptions, that it's a social institution with a biological foundation. I want to say a little bit more now about why it devalues the meaning of marriage for everyone, including same-sex couples, I believe. And that's because marriage is more than just a union of a man and a woman with view to having children. It ties in with the whole conception of ultimately what it is that holds together society. Indeed, the concept of marriage is really, in the end, something like a covenant between the generations. The trouble is that's now being replaced by just the idea of a contract of cohabitation. Why? Because the family, in its universal sense, is a present union that links the past to the future. As such, marriage and the family constitute the foundation of both community and society. But this is what we've now replaced with just something concerned with the present condition, the present individual rights of individuals. There's no sense in which we are now thinking of marriage as a social institution linking past to present and future. Roger Scruton is very good on this, and I want to briefly refer to some of his ideas. The first point he's made is that marriage is inextricably intertwined with sexual fidelity and procreation. That means that it marks the commitment of one generation to the well-being and flourishing of the next. So marriage isn't just about two individuals, it's about the next generation, indeed the one thereafter. The bonds of marriage combine the nurture and culture of children with protection against sexual jealousy and predatory behavior. In other words, marriage is very much pro-children and pro-women as well as pro-man. Because you could say that without marriage, everyone would be behaving far worse. So it's a sort of civilizing institutions for everyone. There's not the same kind of jealousy, there's not the same kind of predatory behavior. People have to cooperate, and the discipline involved in marriage and family, as we all know from personal experience, is very high. And that's also why you have family breakdown, because families can be under strain through labor or other conditions, and it makes it very difficult. But it is this disciplining dimension of marriage and family that's so important. Linked to these disciplining functions is a unique form of social and economic cooperation, with a mutually supportive division of roles that more than doubles the effectiveness of each partner in their shared bid for the future. In other words, everyone is a winner in this, if people can embrace the discipline and abide by the sort of rules of behavior. Because as we know, individuals on their own are always worse off, because there's distrust, there's a lack of cooperation. You need institutions to bridge the gap between individual distrust of others. And family and marriage are, of course, among the primary institutions to overcome any distrust between individuals. The transcendent union of matrimony is also reflected in a distinct social aura that marriage tends to enjoy in very different cultures. That is to say, it's a rite of passage. So in that sense, it's neither just individual or social, it's almost a change in our human condition. It's like the rites of passage involved in education, or the rites of passage involved when you are given a professional recognition. It changes your very being. It's not just a matter of temporary choice. And in that sense, we need marriage because it's part of the rites of passage. It's a way of marking that you're becoming an adult, and that you're taking on responsibility for more than just yourself. And in that sense, again, if we reduce marriage to just a temporary contract of cohabitation, we're losing that very important dimension, the sort of social aura, the rite of passage that's involved in marriage. Now, I just want to say something very briefly about why I think we can do much more to support family marriage. I'll just be 1 minute, and then I'll conclude. So, why is it important to support marriage and the family in light of what I've said? Well, first of all, because the practice of marriage goes very much beyond what the law now posits. So for the law, it's just a temporary contract of cohabitation, but in practice, marriage and family are so much more. And what we really need are forms of public recognition of the full richness of the institution of marriage and family. And there's ways of recognizing this beyond just little sort of token symbols. I think what we should have is much more legal and institutional support for maternity and paternity leave, because we know that one of the main factors involved in family breakdown and divorce is the difficulty that couples have in combining work with family, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to combine a career for men and women with having children, and it's already been discussed here this morning. So we need to think much more creatively what institutions we can set up to help people have families and careers, because I do think it's important that we promote the active participation of women in the labour market as well, but it should not be at the expense of the family. So for instance, employers, I think, have to be strongly encouraged to set up many more childcare facilities. We can't leave it all to the central state. I think businesses have to provide maternity and paternity support, but also nurseries and so on. I think in terms of education, we need to do far more to promote the idea that family isn't just a reactionary, nostalgic institution, but one that very much shapes the future. Because without it, we are all less cooperative, less trusting, and in some sense, less human. Again, it's not to say there's a single type of marriage or a single type of family. It's simply to stress the importance of social bonds that go beyond individual rights. If we just talk about individual rights, we forget the mutual obligations. And then I think there are more concrete things that can be done as well, including, I think, help for families in terms of inheritance tax, maybe some tax breaks as well for married couples in certain income groups, because it seems to me that the financial strain, again linked to the cost of childcare, is making it increasingly difficult. And we already know that many couples decide to have no children or only one, when they would probably like to have 2 or 3. So in short, I think the problem with gay marriage is that it reduces marriage to a contract of cohabitation rather than a social institution with a biological foundation. I think that it diminishes marriage for everyone because it reduces it to just a contractual relationship. There are other problems which aren't all reducible to that, but I think it's part of a wider worrying trend towards a post-humanist future, and I think we need to combine our concern for equality with a support for social bonds, mutual obligations, and the recognition that people do something for themselves and for society when they have stable, loving relationships. And indeed, these stable, loving relationships can also be same-sex relationships. But since these relationships differ from other sex relationships, we should have different institutions to recognize the diversity and difference of these different relationships. Thank you very much.